Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Recently, New Mexico and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District got permission from Texas and Colorado to use stored water, more than 12 billion gallons in the El Vado Reservoir. The Interstate Stream Commission says the last time New Mexico was granted emergency use of that stored water was in the 1950s. That gives you an idea of how the fast snowpack melt, low rainfall, and hot conditions are combining to present real problems in our region. But there is a long-term concern as well, the so-called megadrought in the Southwest. My guest today drove 350 miles and met with scientists to discuss the megadrought and what it could mean for our region. We welcome to Newsmakers Henry Fountain. He is climate reporter for the New York Times. Henry, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I should say you're joining us from your home in Albuquerque, and lots of miles traveled there, learning about the megadrought, as it's been called. I want to start with that question. I mean, your overall impression of just how serious this situation is. Is it as serious as it sounds, megadrought?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the word mega makes it sound even more serious, but any drought is a serious problem. And what makes people talk about this being a mega drought is not so much the extreme dryness of a given year, but the length of time. So essentially, except for a couple of wet years, this region, the Southwest, has been dry since the year 2000. So basically 2 decades. Mega droughts have occurred in the Southwest before in the past 1,200 years. And this 20-year drought, the fear, I guess, or the concern is that it will go on and on and on and become like one of these in the past that lasted for 40 years. There was one even, I think, in the 1500s that lasted for at least 8 decades. So,
and what do we know, Henry, about that when it does last that long? I mean, what kind of information do we have about what that could mean?
Well, we don't have, obviously, the world of 1500 was a lot different than the 21st century in terms of population and agriculture and industry. But we know any period of water scarcity affects agriculture, it affects drinking water, it affects industry, it affects everything. So, the Southwest has experienced this for the last 20 years, and we all know what we've been going through. Periods where farmers really had to worry whether they had enough water, cities had to institute drought restrictions, and those kind of situations will just increase. As I was saying, though, nobody really knows whether this drought will last for another 20 or 30 or 40 years, but the indications are it could, and climate change makes it more likely that it will.
Okay, I want to get to some specific questions now from your article in the New York Times. You explain that the warm spring that we had was a real problem this year because the snowpack melted very quickly. Explain why a fast melt is not as helpful in drought as a slow melt of that snowpack.
Well, there's a couple of problems. The main problem is from a water management standpoint. If you're running a reservoir or a water manager for a city, you're expecting, or for an agricultural area, you're expecting a certain flow, a certain sort of steady flow, and a plan when you're going to release that water for its needed purposes. So if everything kind of rushes at the beginning, you kind of get overwhelmed and you don't have enough at the tail end. You may not have enough capacity in your reservoir to handle such an immediate rush as well. That's certainly been a problem in the Southwest. It's been a big problem in California in the last 5 or so years. So that's really the problem with an early snowmelt. Essentially what happens is you have, as the Southwest had a pretty decent snow year this past year, snowpack year, but because it melted so fast, because the spring warm up was so quick, you don't end up with as much water runoff as you expect.
Yeah, and of course it has been an extremely hot spring and a very hot start to the summer. I've lived here 12 years, and this certainly has been the longest stretch that since I've been here of triple-digit temperatures, where you just day after day it's 100 degrees or more, and that's also a concern. So you have these various conditions coming together: very hot weather, then a fairly dry spring, and this fast snowmelt. And I don't think a lot of people who haven't lived here a long time understand the significance of the snowpack, that we really depend on that snowmelt to keep the Rio Grande for a longer period having water in it. And that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, for the first time since the 1950s, there was a request to actually use stored water from a reservoir, and it was granted, the request, which is kind of news in and of itself, I guess, because it's such a contentious issue with Texas and Colorado to get an agreement quickly. They obviously realize the seriousness of this.
Right. And so the Rio Grande, as we know, is a very managed river. It's been managed for 100 years. There's really not a speck of water that's not accounted for somehow. It's the same as the Colorado River on a sort of a smaller scale. And that's all well and good in a wet year when there's enough water to go around. The problem is in a dry year or in a succession of dry years, then you really start having to, decide, are you going to deny this group of people or this group of farmers water or whatever, and it becomes a real juggling act. And I assume the reason they allowed that water to be used is normally that water would have to go down to the Elephant Butte Reservoir near you, because there's a part of the management of the river is that the only way the northern part of New Mexico can use Rio Grande water essentially is if that Elephant Butte Reservoir gets to a certain level. And I imagine what happened is everybody said, listen, Elephant Butte's not at the right level, but the north really needs the water, so we're going to free up some water despite what the regulations say. So, it's just another indication, like, all of this is great. All of this development in the Southwest, all of this planning for water use is great. But once water starts to dry up, it becomes much, much more of a difficult problem.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at now. And again, the fear is, a lot of people thought, well, we had a decent snowpack this year. Maybe this is like going to be a good year, a good wet year. And maybe they'll string a couple of good years together and sort of kiss the drought goodbye. But the super warm spring kind of negated all that. So We're still in drought.
Absolutely. Doesn't look too good. Well, in your article, you interviewed a researcher that we have spoken with as well, Park Williams, and you write about the fact that Williams was lead researcher on a study that does connect global warming to what is known as the emerging megadrought. Tell me about this and what you learned from him. Great researcher, great person to talk to, by the way.
Yeah, and he's based in New York. But he really knows Southwestern issues, and he's more of what we call a paleoclimatologist. He looks at past climate, and that's what he did in this case. They looked at tree ring data from the last 1,200 years to determine these times when there was no water around and the trees didn't grow, essentially. And so they uncovered like 4 or 5 of these episodes, one of which, as I said, lasted something like 80 years. And then compared that to what's been happening in the last 20 years here and saw very similar situations. So that's why they're calling this an emerging megadrought. He's he was one of the people who thought, well, maybe this year would be a wet year and we'd get by. But he realized once like it started warming up in April, that was off the table. So
Yeah, and you point out in your story, which I think is so important, that a drought can be really complex, that it's more than just low precipitation and high temperatures.
yeah, that's really one of the things I really learned a lot about was, you can, as we found out, you can have a decent snowpack, but then for various reasons, not just warming temperatures, but less cloud cover can have an effect. Things like wind can really affect it, how much water you get out of the snow, because if it's really windy and really dry, and obviously it is down here, you get what's called sublimation, where the snow, the solid water snow, turns directly to water vapor and doesn't become a liquid, and so you never get the liquid runoff. And that's something that the person I met with up in Colorado for this story, the snow hydrologist, a U.S. Geological Survey researcher named Graham Sexton, he is really interested in sublimation and thinks it has a big effect on how much of a runoff you get for a given amount of snow. But as he pointed out, it's not really well known what sort of affects why there's more sublimation or why there's less. So it's a whole field of research that's going to become increasingly important again as water becomes more precious.
One factor I had not heard about until reading your article was the impact of dust settling on snow.
That's absolutely another one. It changes, darker dust, soil particles essentially, that fall on snow. It's the sort of same what goes on in the Arctic. So you have dark particles landing on the white snow. If there were no particles at all, white snow reflects a lot of sunlight. But once you put some dark soot or dust on it, those dark particles absorb sunlight and generate heat. It's like a black car versus a white car on a sunny day. Black cars get much warmer. So that raises the temperature, and that causes more melting, more rapid melting. So there's all these factors like that researchers are really trying to get a hold on. For the U.S. Geological Survey, their primary interest is to be able to forecast runoff better. So if they know what the snowpack is, they'll be able to tell water managers in the Colorado or in the Rio Grande, wherever, the snowpack is good, but we're anticipating this, we're anticipating dry conditions, windy conditions, dust storms, etc., that will really bring the runoff down.
Yeah, and speaking of snowpack, you note in your story that there are hundreds of sites across the West that monitor snowpack. It's a system that dates back, apparently, as you said, into the 1960s, right?
Yeah, into the 1960s. It's fairly rudimentary in that it tells you how much snow there is, how much water that snow would produce if it all melted, and it's all connected actually through a basic radio network. There's actually snow measurements that date back even farther that were done, still being done today by researchers who basically go out on skis with a long sort of tube and sample the snow, and various, by weighing it or whatever, they're able to tell what's called snow water equivalent, how much water the snow would produce. The problem for people like Dr. Sexton and others is, while that data is all very good, it's limited. It was set up, as you said, 40, 50 years ago. It doesn't capture, it's not designed to sort of get data that would let them look at these nuanced things like sublimation or insolation, the amount of direct sunlight on snow as opposed to cloud cover. So they're in the process of developing a lot fewer number of sites, but some sites to do what's called the next generation of water observing, to try to get a better handle on all these other factors that affect runoff.
Do you get the sense that this is a difficult thing for researchers, that they're having a hard time getting the funding to get the kind of equipment and site development that's needed to do this work? Because, I mean, as we've been doing research on this story here, I've heard a lot of frustration about researchers feeling like they need more data about, for instance, even things like the water table, that, the fear that with all the groundwater pumping, that we may not have enough data to know how that's affecting the water table.
Yeah, I think in this particular case, this is a brand new program. It's actually not just in Colorado, which is where Dr. Sexton is working. It was actually set up first in the Delaware River basin in the east. But it's, as I said, it's a small number of sites. They're just sort of figuring out what kind of equipment they need, what kind of instruments they need. They have enough to do a handful of sites. I think if it works and they want to really build it out, then they're going to have some funding problems, because it's going to be expensive. But then again, the value of what they can provide in terms of telling the whole region what to expect water-wise, it's worth it.
Yeah. I mentioned this to you before we started to talk today, that in Las Cruces, the second largest city in New Mexico, we're somewhat unusual in that all of our drinking water comes from the ground, and many here are increasingly concerned about groundwater pumping for agriculture that may threaten the water supply. From your body of work on climate, give me a sense of how this is playing out in the West, because we know this is an issue in other places as well in the West, where agriculture accounts for usually anywhere from 80 to 90% of the water use.
Sure. Well, it's a big problem in California, which has, significantly more agriculture than New Mexico. And as anybody who's driven through the Central Valley can see, all that water is coming from the ground. It's not surface water, or almost all that water. Even Albuquerque, we get some of our water from groundwater pumping. We get some of our water from the Colorado through a diversion tunnel. But the problem with groundwater is, first of all, there's competing. Las Cruces uses it for your population, but all the farmers around you also use it. So there's competing uses. And the problem with climate change is, as it gets warmer, as you get more evaporation, less snowpack, less reliable runoff, some of that water runs into the ground and replenishes the groundwater. And if you get less of that recharge, less of that replenishment, well, eventually you're going to draw down you're going to pump your groundwater dry. And that, as we talked about before we went on the air, that's been happening in southern New Mexico. There's wells in the Central Valley in California where 10 years ago they had to pump water up from 50 feet down. Now they're pumping water up from 250 feet down. And it's much more expensive from an energy standpoint. And eventually, you keep pumping and your well's going to run dry, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And we've had that happen in residential wells. That has occurred, where folks have to dig a deeper well in order to keep their water supply. You specialize in the science of climate change in your reporting, and certainly there has been increasing interest on this topic, a lot more reporting on the topic, but there's still, as you know, a real lack of knowledge by many people in the general public. What are the things that you most want the average person who doesn't report on this all the time, who doesn't read that much about this, what you want them to understand about climate change?
Well, I think really the most important thing to understand is that, for a long time, everybody talked about climate change as something that was going to happen, down the road, in the future, we're going to be looking at this and this. And certainly some of the stories I do are about future impacts. I just wrote a story that published yesterday about how warming might lead to the extinction of most polar bears by 2100, by the end of the century. But if there's one thing people really need to understand, is that climate change is happening now. And we're seeing it in a lot of ways. And it's not just people whose homes are flooding on the East Coast or the West Coast. It's things like the water supply in the Southwest. As Park Williams said about the megadrought, well, megadroughts occurred in the past, and with natural climate variability, you expect droughts will come and go. The problem is you add a couple of degrees warming on top of that, and you tilt the scale, and you make it much more likely that a plain ordinary drought in a given year is going to be worse, and you make it more likely that a 5-year drought is going to become a 10-year drought, or a 10-year drought will become a 40-year drought. So climate change is happening now. That's what people have to realize. And they need to think about what we as a society are going to do about it.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Henry, a lot has been said about the pandemic's possible effect on attitudes about climate change. Most of us have seen the remarkable photos of major cities all over the world with clear skies placed up against those same cities before the pandemic, when there was a lot more traffic and activity, lots of smog before the pandemic. Do you think that that might have some effect, or that it'll just be forgotten when the pandemic ends?
I think that has some effect. I mean, what you're seeing is not necessarily it's not slowing down climate change, but it's improving the immediate environment. So it's getting some of the not the greenhouse gases, but the pollutants that affect respiratory health and things like that out of the sky. I think people see that. I was in New York when 9/11 happened, and the fact that they didn't fly airplanes around for another, well, in New York it was probably for another 10 days or so. Skies cleared up the same way then, and everybody remarked on it. I think that had some effect on people realizing, we do affect what our environment is like. We greatly affect it. I've had the good fortune of traveling to Antarctica twice, and one of the most incredible things about it is, it's beautiful and pristine and everything. The most amazing thing to me is how clear the skies are there. And you can see for miles and miles and miles. It must be what the explorers, experienced when they first came to the Western United States. Just, beautiful scenes miles and miles away. So, you get an indication of things could actually be better than they are. So hopefully it'll inspire some people.
One other maybe glimmer of hope on this is that, I'm sure you've noticed this, that younger folks seem to be much more passionate about climate and protecting the environment.
Yeah. And, I keep telling my son, my generation is kind of messed up on this, and you've got to, unfortunately, we're going to leave it for you guys to clean up. But thank goodness that you're all feeling, that you need to do something. And I think that's true. I mean, who knows, what 20, 30 years down the road, and we're making some strides. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of work to do. We really need to transition to a cleaner energy system. But I think if there's any hope, it lies with younger people, certainly not my generation at this point.
What's the next big story you want to do, or will you share it with us, Henry?
Oh gosh, well, I really want to. This sounds kind of boring in a way, but I really want to do some stories about something that most people don't really think about much, which is the effect of climate change on ocean circulation, which affects weather. Among other things, it affects weather, it affects fishing, affects a lot of things. There's particularly a lot of things happening in the Southern Ocean, in the South Atlantic and South Pacific. And it's just something that most people haven't thought about or written about. So I think it'd be a really interesting subject to delve into. The problem is making the stories interesting, which is important if people are going to read them.
This was a very interesting story that you wrote about megadrought in the Southwest. So I hope you'll be doing more reporting about indications of where this is going in the Southwest. I wonder, Henry, in terms of looking at climate in terms of the entire country, the United States, if you think that some of the biggest drivers may continue to be events that occur, as we've seen over the last decade, major hurricanes where we lose a lot of very expensive property along the coasts, and wildfires, as we've seen out here in the West, that some attribute to climate change and the severity of those wildfires, the number of wildfires. That may be the biggest driver of really political will and action. Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, if you look at surveys over the last 10 years, definitely far fewer people think climate change is a hoax. More people are concerned about it. And I think a lot of that is because more people have been directly affected. I mean, living in New York for years and years and years, I experienced Hurricane Sandy back in whatever it was, 2013. People in New Orleans know what, Katrina did to them. Florida has had incredible experience with hurricanes. And out here, wildfires, have affected hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that's true. I think, if you're directly affected by something, you're more likely to care about it. And if so, I mean, it's terrible to have to go through that to get the appreciation. But if more people appreciate the problem and want to do something about it, that's a good thing.
Well, thank you for sharing a part of your knowledge today with us here at KRWG, and people can read lots more of your work in the New York Times. Henry Fountain is the climate reporter for the New York Times. Henry, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we would love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.